Okay, so this project was created in a way that I can fully explain most of the fundamentals of React and do it in a way where we're actually building something and working toward a goal because I really enjoy hands-on teaching and I like creating projects. So what we're ultimately going to end up with is a feedback application, something you'd have for a product or a service. And this is going to allow us to touch on everything from components, props, state, events. We're going to be using the context API, and basically we'll build the client side app first, and then we're going to use a tool called JSON Server, which will give us a mock REST API or kind of like a fake backend to work with so that we can make requests as if it were a full stack app. And I haven't decided yet, but I might also include a section where we actually build a backend with Node and Express, but I haven't decided on that just yet because that would be outside the scope of React. So let's just look at a quick demo. So basically we have our feedback items here. We have a stats component that's going to show the number of reviews or feedback items. Also going to take the average rating of all the items. And we can add one, let's say we'll rate this as a 9, and then we can write a review. And you'll notice that as I type, we'll get this text must be at least 10 characters. The button is also disabled, so we have some real-time validation going on. So we'll say this is a test, and as soon as we hit 10 characters, then the send button is active and I can go ahead and send. And you notice we have a little bit of a fading animation. We're going to use something called frame or motion to add that effect. So we can add them. We can also update. Okay, later on we're going to get into the update part of it where we can click this pencil icon here, and then whatever one we click is going to get put into the form so that we can edit it. So we'll go to this one here and we'll just say this is an updated, an updated text, and then we'll change it to, let's say 8, and we send, and you'll see that that will get updated. Okay, we can also delete. So if we delete, we also have a little fade out effect, and the average and the number of reviews will also react to whatever changes in the state, which at first is going to be just kept in the main app component, but then we're going to move it to context using the context API. We're also going to use a hook called use context. And then I also have this little question mark down here. The only reason for this is to show you how the React router works. So if I click on this, you'll see it'll just take us to this very simple about page, because I did want to include the router in this project and how we can create links and all that. All right, so we hit a lot of points with this little application. So that's it. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so we're going to get started on our first project, and this is a very hands-on course. Like most of my courses, I like to actually build projects and teach while we're building them. Although for this project, I will take the first couple sections or the first batch of videos kind of slow so I can fully explain some of the fundamentals like components and props and state and so on. So if you do already have experience with React, just kind of bear with me for the first couple sections or so. So this is React.js.org. This is where we can find all the documentation. If you go over here, you have all your main concepts. You have some advanced guides, API reference, hooks, and so on. So you can use the documentation as kind of a supplement for the course. Now under installation, if we go to create a new React app and we scroll down here, you'll see that there's a tool, a command line interface tool called Create React App, which does just that. So we can either install this globally with npm install -g, or we can just run it with npx, which won't install the tool on your machine. It'll just let you run it to create a new React application. So that's what we're going to do. And you do have to have Node.js installed in order to do this. So make sure you do have that. So let's open up a terminal, either your Mac, Linux, Windows terminal, command prompt, whatever. And let's run npx create -react-app, and then whatever we want to call this, I'm just going to call it feedback app. And then I'm also going to add --use-npm so that I can use npm over yarn. And what this will do is it'll create a new folder called feedback app, or whatever you called it here, and it will add all the files and folders and dependencies that we need in order to create a React application. All right, so once that's done, you'll see that we can then cd or change directory into our feedback app. So we'll go ahead and do that. Let's cd feedback app. And now we're in the project folder. So from here, you can see that there's a few scripts that we can run, or a few commands. We have npm start, which will start the development server. We're going to do that in a second. npm run build is going to basically bundle all your JavaScript, and it's going to create your static assets for production, so for when you're ready to deploy. npm test will start the test runner. Create React app actually comes with the JS testing library. And then npm run eject will basically kind of remove your app from the Create React app environment so you can access your Webpack configurations and things like that. It's not something you'll have to do very often. In fact, I don't think I've ever had to run npm run eject. Now, we're going to run the server, but I first just want to open up my text editor, which I'm using VS Code, in this feedback app folder. So I can do that with code dot. That's just going to open up VS Code in the current directory. And if the code command doesn't work for you for some reason, you can just open up VS Code and do a Command-Shift-P and just search for shell, and you'll see this install code command in path. You can just click on that, and then that code command should be available to you. So I'm going to go ahead and run the dev server, but I'm not going to run it from my main terminal here. I'm going to run it from the integrated terminal in VS Code. So you can open that with Command tilde, or Control tilde on Windows, or you can go up to the menu and go to View and then Integrated Terminal. So from here, I'm going to run npm start, and that should start up the dev server for us on localhost 3000. Close that up. So you should see something like this. It might look a little different depending on when you're watching this, but it should be some kind of simple landing page. Now let's go over some of the files and folders here. So in package.json, we have all of our dependencies, and this includes, of course, React, which is our main framework or library, and then React DOM, which is used to basically allow React to work with the document object model, so the browser. So whenever you create a web app, you're going to be using React alongside of the React DOM library. Then React scripts just gives us some additional tools like the dev server. Web Vitals will allow us to see some performance analytics. We're not going to really deal with this, but it is included with Create React App. And then you just see the scripts that I've already explained here. All right, now there's two main folders to begin with here. There's a public folder and a source folder. So in public, you have your index.html. And when we talk about single page applications or spas, which is what we're creating here, this is the single page that is being loaded in the browser. Okay, so the browser loads this HTML page, which has some basic meta tags, as you can see in the head. But in the body, all it has is a div with the ID of root. Now, the reason for that is when we build a single page application, everything we do, including all of our components, any routes that we have, everything is done within JavaScript. It's done within React. And then it's basically inserted into this div. So this div you can think of as like a placeholder for our entire front end, our entire user interface. And I'm going to show you how React knows to put it here in a minute. But basically what I want to do in this index.html is just clear it up a little bit. So it has a lot of comments, and you don't have to do this, but I like to just clear this up. And then there's also a page title, just says React App. I'm going to go ahead and change that to, let's change it to Feedback UI, or whatever you like. And you can also put in CDNs here. For example, if you wanted to use Font Awesome or something like that, you could put in these in the head tags. But we'll look more into that later. So let's save that, and you'll see automatically the server will reload. So you can see the title has changed. So whenever we make any changes and save, the server will automatically reload. And then as far as what else we have in the public folder, you can see there's the favicon. Any static assets you want to put in here, like images, you can do that. But the source folder is basically where all the magic happens. That's where we create all of our components, all of our context. Anything that we do is really going to go in this source folder. Now, usually I would just kind of go through and explain some of these files, but what I'm going to do, and what I'd like you to do, is just delete everything in the source folder. Okay, so you should have nothing in the source folder, and we're going to see an error over here because it's looking for a file called index.js in the source folder, which we no longer have. And what I want to do, the reason I deleted all this is so that we can, in the next video, recreate the files so you can see exactly what's going on and how React is actually initialized. All right, so in the last video, we did something a little crazy. We deleted everything in the source folder. Now, the truth is, a lot of that stuff we didn't need. There was like a logo and some CSS files. So we're just going to recreate the things that we need. So first of all, let's create a file called index.js. That's what it's being looked for. Now, you might see this page again. Now, this is just cached in your browser. We deleted the component that was actually displaying this. So if you're seeing this on Windows, you can do Shift F5, that'll do a hard refresh. If you're on a Mac, you can do Command Shift R, and that will do a hard refresh. And you should now just see a blank white page. Now, this page that we're seeing is that public index.html file, right? You can see the title up here, feedback UI. And if we were to go into this HTML file and just type something in here and save, you'll see that's going to show up. Now, what we want to do is, like I said in the last video, this div right here, we want to insert our front-end application, our React app, into that div. So that happens in the index.js. This is basically the entry point to React. So let's go ahead and first thing we want to do is import React. So we're going to import that from React. And then we also want to import React DOM. So that's going to be /dash DOM, and then this will be React DOM. And like I said earlier, the React DOM library allows us to basically interact with the document object model in the browser. So React DOM has a method on it that we want to call called render. So we're going to say .render. And this is going to take in two things. The first is whatever we want to insert, which is going to be our main app component ultimately. But for now, we'll just put an H1. Oh, can't use them in here. We'll just put an H1 in here, and we'll just say my app. Okay, and then the second argument is going to be where we want to put this, and we want to put it in that div with the ID of root. So we're going to do document.getElementById, which is just a vanilla JavaScript method on the document object, and we want the ID of root. Now, if I save that, we might have to do a hard reload here. So now we'll see the H1 that's being put into that main div. Now, like I said, we don't want to just have our H1. Right now, that's our entire application. What we want to do is have our main app component displayed here. So React is made up of components, and you have a root component called app. And then any other components we create, like maybe like a navigation, feedback items, whatever it might be, that's going to be embedded into that main app component. All right, so let's go ahead and create inside of source a file called app, uppercase A, app.js, and this is going to be our main app component. Now, as far as components, they can be either classes or functions. Classes are kind of the old school way of creating React components. With more modern React, you're going to see functional components using something called hooks to use state and do some other things with state and lifecycle. So we're going to create a function here, and we're going to call it app. Okay, so this is going to be our main app component, and what we want to return from this is something called JSX, which stands for JavaScript XML. So it's a syntax extension that basically allows us to have some syntactic sugar to put HTML directly into our JavaScript. So from here, let's go ahead and return, and we're just going to put this in parentheses, although I think Prettier is going to delete them, but that's fine. We're just going to put an H1 in here, and let's say hello from the app. We'll say hello from the app component. Okay, and yeah, Prettier did delete the parentheses. But now this function or this component is returning what looks like HTML, but is actually JSX, which is just an H1. We do have to export this, so we're going to export as default app. And then let's go into our index.js and let's bring that in here. So we'll say import app, and that's going to be from./app. So now that we've brought that in, let's go to where we have this H1, because obviously that's not what we want here. And we want to display our app component. Now the way that we embed components is with an XML-like syntax. So we just do app, close that off. So we just put it in angle brackets, And if I save that, we might have to do a hard reload here. And we should see hello from the app component, because that's what we're returning from our main app component is an H1 with that text. Okay, so as you can see, in the public folder, the index.html is being loaded in the browser, and then we're bringing in React with the React DOM library. We're calling React DOM render, passing in our main app component, and that's being output into that div with the ID of root. In fact, if I open up my Elements tab here and we check this out, you should see a div with the ID of root, and inside that is just our H1, because that's what's in our app component. Now there is something called strict mode that React offers that adds additional checks and warnings within our application. So what we would do is this, where we have our app component, we're going to wrap this. We're going to wrap this with React dot and then strict mode. Okay, so we just want to move this up into here like that. All right, we're not going to see any difference, but this just activates some additional checks and warnings, and this is what was here before I actually deleted the index.js. Now the last thing I want to do here, the last file I want to create is a global CSS file. So in our source folder, let's create a file called index.css. And there's a lot of different ways to do styling in React. I would say the easiest way is to just have a global style sheet with all your classes and so on. And that's what we're going to do in this particular project. And the way that we can bring this in is in our index.js. Let's go right above where we bring the app component in. And let's say import. And we just want to import index.css. Actually, we want to do /index.css. Okay, now just to test this out, I'll go into index.css and just do body display none. And that should, yeah, so now the body's gone. So this is now our global CSS. And I'm not going to put anything in here just yet, but I did want to just create the file and import it so that it's available to us. So we can now close up index.js, and in the next video we're going to talk more about JSX, which is what we're returning from our React components. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about JSX because we're going to be writing a lot of it. It's what all of our React components return. And it's basically HTML, however, it's syntactic sugar. It's really JavaScript under the hood. It just allows us to write HTML within our components, which makes it much, much more convenient. In fact, I'm going to show you how we could do something very simple without using JSX and using pure JavaScript to return something. Now, there are some rules. So we could wrap this return in parentheses. You'll see that a lot like this. And then I just want to show you that, let's say we wanted to have a paragraph in addition to this. Let's just change this to like, we'll just change it to my app. Okay. And let's say that I want to have a paragraph in addition to this. So if I go ahead and I put a paragraph here and I say hello, you'll see I already get some linting errors in VS Code. It says JSX expressions must have one parent element. And if I were to save this, it's going to break, and basically it says the same thing. It says JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. What that means is what we return directly has to be just one main or parent element. So we can't have an H1 and a paragraph or any two or more elements. It has to be one. So in this case, what we would do is we could have a div, and then we could take this and put that in here, and that's fine. So we still have our H1 in our paragraph, however, it's wrapped in one initial element. I couldn't go under here and put like a paragraph or something. That's going to break. Okay, so just remember that you always have to have one parent element. Now you might not want to have a div here, so if I open up my dev tools and we take a look at what we get for our output for our HTML, we have a div wrapped around the H1 and paragraph, in addition to our div with the ID of root, which is always going to be there. That's basically our placeholder. So if I don't want this div here, we still have to have something wrapping this, but we can use what's called a fragment, which is just empty angle brackets like this. So now if I save, you can see now that div is gone. So there's nothing in the actual DOM that's wrapping around these elements, but we still have something within our JSX that is just an empty fragment. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that. Now, there are some differences between HTML and JSX. There's some attributes that you can't use. So for instance, class, let's say that I'm actually going to want a div here. So I'm just going to put a div here, and let's say class equals container. Now, this is still going to work. It's still going to show up. But if we look in the console in our browser, we're going to see this invalid DOM property class. Did you mean class name? So class it's basically a reserved word, so we can't use a class attribute here. Instead, in React, or I should say in JSX, we use class name. So if I do that and reload, you're not going to see that message anymore. Now, what's nice, if you're using VS Code with Emmet, you can just do, dot whatever, my class, and if I hit enter, it's automatically going to make it class name. So that's pretty helpful. Now, another attribute that you can't use in JSX is the for attribute, which isn't that common, but a lot of times when you have forms and you're using labels, you might have a for attribute. So if I create a label here, I'm just going to use Emmet and do label enter. You'll see automatically it uses the correct attribute, which is HTML4. Okay, so instead of this, which you would do in regular HTML, if you want to use for within JSX, you would use HTML4. So those are the two big attributes that are different than just regular HTML. Now, what I want at the moment is just a div with the class name of container and then my app as the text. Now, I want to show you how we could get the same thing without using JSX, just using JavaScript. So basically showing you what's happening under the hood when we do this. So, and you don't have to type this out. This is just to show you as an example. So what we would do is first we would need to import React. So we would say import React from React. And up until just very recently, a recent release, you had to do this no matter what. In all of your components, you had to import React if you were using JSX. You don't have to anymore, but you used to. Now here, what we would do if we don't want to use JSX is on that React object, we have a method called createElement. So we would first have to call that, and let's just close up the sidebar here. So let's say we want a div, right? Because we want to get that div with the class of container and then an h1 inside. So the first thing is to create that div. And this is going to take a second argument of attributes that you want to attach to this. Now remember, we had a class, so let's say class name, and we wanted that set to container. Okay, and then any other attributes would have to go in here as well. Now the third thing we would pass in is what we want inside the div, and in our case we had an h1, so what we would have to do is create another element, and this time it would be an h1. And then the second argument is the attributes. I don't want any attributes, so we just have some empty curly braces. And then what I wanted inside the h1 was some text that said my app. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this now, and you can see we have the same thing on the screen. In fact, if I look at my elements down here and we take a look, so we have a div with the class of container, and then we have an h1 with the text of my app. So this does exactly what we just had in JSX, only this is regular JavaScript. And this might not look too bad, but just imagine if you had just a ton of HTML with different components and different elements and attributes and props. This would be an absolute nightmare to work with. So that's why JSX is so great, and it's why virtually nobody builds components without it. So I'm just going to undo all this and go back to what we had before, which is much easier to work with. So this gives us the same result. Okay, so that's kind of an intro to JSX. Now, we didn't really look at anything dynamic because you can output values and variables and expressions and all that. So we're going to dive into that a little bit in the next video. Okay, so in the next two videos, I'm going to kind of go over some of the basics of components in JSX and outputting dynamic values. We're going to look at creating lists, which basically allow us to loop through an array of values and output some JSX for each item. And then in the next video, we'll look at conditionals. So the code that I'm about to write isn't part of the project. We're going to revert to this after, but I think that it'll give you a good idea of how this stuff works moving forward. Now we have our main app component here. We're returning a little bit of JSX. Now we can go above the return and we can set variables, we can create other functions and so on. So I'm just going to create a variable here called title, and we'll just set this to blog post. And then let's say we have a body, and we'll set that to, we'll just say this is my blog post. Now usually if you have variables like this, like let's say this was a blog post component, this data would probably be part of your state, and this is not how you set state in React. In functional components, there's a hook, a special hook that you use called useState, and I'm going to get to that later. I'm really just putting these variables in here so I can show you how to work with them down here. So this my app in the H1, let's get rid of that, and to output something dynamic like a variable or an expression, we just use curly braces. So here we could put our title, and then let's say we have a paragraph, and in here we'll put our body. If I save that, now it's going to show our title and our body. Now, like I said, these curly braces can be used not only for variables, but also for any type of expression, really. So if I go in here and I do like 5 plus 5 and save that, it's going to evaluate it and it's going to output 10. I could even put like math.random and multiply that by 5 plus 5, which is 10, which will give us some random decimal up to 10. All right, so you can put pretty much any JavaScript expression in here. In fact, for this title, if I wanted to, I could even add to uppercase, which is just a JavaScript method, to make that title uppercase. So now what I want to do is show you how you can create a list, because you might have an array. Let's say we have an array of comments here, and each one has an ID and a text value. So we'll say comment 1, and let's just copy this down. So we have comment 1, comment 2, 3, and then we'll just change the IDs here to 2, 3. All right, so we have this array of comments, and what I'd like is to have each one of these text values output in a list item. So let's go under the paragraph here, and we'll actually create a new div here called comments. And let's have an H3, and we'll just say comments. And maybe we even want to put the number of comments inside some parentheses here. To do that, we just open up our curly braces, take the comments array, and call the length property. So now you can see we have comments, we have 3. And then under that, I want to have a UL. And then, like I said, I'll put a list item for each comment text. In that case, we create what's called a list, and we do that with the map high order array method, which you should know things like for each, map, filter before you start to learn a framework, but that's not always the case. So let's say comments, which is our array, and then dot map. Now map takes in a function, so I'm going to pass in an arrow function, and what I'm going to return from this is JSX. So I'm going to open up some parentheses, and inside the callback that goes into map, we can define whatever we want each one to be called, in this case just comment, and we can also get the index, which is just, it starts at 0 and then increments upwards. Now in here I want to output an LI, so we're basically saying for each comment I want to output a list item. And in that list item, I want the comment.text, right? Because comment is each individual object up here. We want to get the text. So if I save that, we should now see on the screen comment 1, 2, and 3. Now if I open up my console here, we're going to see a warning that says each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So the list item is the child in this list, and it's telling us it needs a key prop. So a key is basically, a prop is basically like an attribute. So we need to pass in a key that's unique, and we're going to set that. So you can set a prop or an attribute to something dynamic with curly braces, and in here we'll just use index, which is coming from here. You could also use the comment ID because that's going to be unique as well. Now if I reload, we're not going to see that message. So just make sure when you create a list using map that you add a key onto the child prop here. The child element. All right, so that's how we can output variables, expressions, create lists. In the next video, I want to go over conditionals. Okay, in this video, I want to go over conditionals within our React component. And after this, we'll really start to work on our application. We're going to create our header component and talk about props and all that. So let's say that I want to have a specific return value or return JSX based on a specific condition. So for instance, we might have a value called loading, and let's set loading to true. Now, if loading is set to true, I want to return something different than what we have here. So I could just simply put an if statement here, and I could say if loading, then we want to return, and let's just put an h1 and say loading ... So we'll go ahead and save that, and now you can see that only this is being rendered because this loading value is true, and we're setting this conditional. And a common case for this would be if you're fetching data from a back end, like let's say this blog data was coming from a back end, you might have loading set to true while it's being fetched, and then when loading is set to false, it'll go ahead and render the actual data, because you don't want to try to render data before you actually fetch it. But we'll get into that later. So let's say that let's put this back to false, and let's say that we only want to return a portion of this JSX, or we want something different within here depending on a condition. So I'll add another variable up here. Let's call it show comments, and let's set that to false. Now, to have a conditional within here, you're usually going to use a ternary operator, because we can have JavaScript expressions within these curly braces, and that includes ternary operators, which is just a shorthand conditional. So for instance, let's open up some curly braces, and let's say show comments. So the first thing you're going to put in here is the condition. We're just saying here if show comments is true, then, so the question mark is a ternary, which basically represents then. Then let's output yes, and then if we want an else, we do else no. If I save that, we should see no over here on the screen, and if I change show comments back to true, we should see yes. Now, obviously, I don't want to output yes and no. What I want to output is this div with the class of comments. I'm going to cut this, and I want to output that if show comments is set to true. So I'm going to replace this, because you can directly put JSX in here. Let's put it in parentheses though, and we'll paste that in. If I save that, we're still going to see no, and we no longer see the comments. If I set show comments to true, then we should see the comments here. All right, now I'm going to set it back to false because I don't need an else in this case, right? If show comments is false, I don't need to show this no. So a shorthand for this, I mean, you could do this. You could just have null, and that's fine. But instead of using a ternary, instead of using a question mark, we could use double ampersand, and then we could get rid of the else null, like that. So if I save, that all this is doing is saying if show comments is true, then go ahead and show this. Okay, and I'll go ahead and set show comments to true so we can see it. Now you could break this up even further, and this is all preference right here. But if you wanted to, you could take the JSX that's in this conditional and cut it, and you could put it in its own variable. So we could go up here and we could say const, call it comment block, and we could set that to the JSX, and then we can go down here, and it just broke because of this. But instead of putting the all the markup in here directly, we could just put in our comment block. Okay, and that's going to do the same thing. So we simply just broke it up and put this specific JSX into its own variable, and then we have this conditional show comments, then show the comment block. All right, so I mean, this isn't part of the project, but I think that it'll give you some good foundation moving forward as to how we can output dynamic values and create lists and conditionals and so on. Now I'm going to just clear this up. So let's see, let's get rid of comment block here. Let's get rid of all of these variables. And all I want to return is an H1, and we'll go back to just my app. All right, good. So in the next video, we're going to go ahead and start on our first component, our first custom component, which is going to be the header.